Before the Bible, before the prophets, before humanity ever learned how to name light or darkness, there was a truth that was deliberately stripped from history. Not forgotten by accident, but removed with intent, as libraries were burned, countless writings were erased or allowed to disappear, and generations were taught never to look in its direction. Today, you are about to hear it anyway. And here's the question that changes everything. What if the God you were taught to worship was not the highest source of reality at all? What if the Creator described in Genesis, the voice that spoke the world into being, was himself shaped by something far greater, something so vast it exists beyond language, beyond thought, beyond existence itself? Ancient mystics spoke of this source in whispers. They gave it a name, and for that name, they were silenced, hunted, erased. This is not something you were meant to stumble upon. You were never supposed to ask these questions, yet here you are, listening. That isn't random. Some truths don't reveal themselves to everyone. They wait for the right moment, the right mind, the right level of readiness. And if you're still here, something deep within you already recognizes that there is more to reality than you were taught. More than doctrines, more than rules, more than the story handed down to you. This is not about destroying faith. It's about looking beyond the surface and remembering what was buried. If any part of this stirs something inside you, if it feels familiar in a way you can't explain, take that as a sign. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and step forward, because what comes next isn't just information. It's a doorway into the part of the truth they never wanted you to see. If the last door you touched opened a crack in the story you were given, this is where the light from the other side begins to reach you. Long before sermons, before pews, before lessons meant to be memorized instead of felt, there were places hidden from ordinary sight where truth was never spoken loudly, only breathed in shadows. Not classrooms, not temples polished for the public, but forgotten sanctuaries and sealed scrolls written in tongues time itself has almost erased, where mystics carried ideas too heavy for crowds to hold. In those quiet margins of history lived a teaching so spare, so complete, that saying it out loud felt dangerous, as if naming it might fracture the world you stood in. They spoke of the One, the Absolute, the unknowable source behind all appearances, not as a ruler watching from above, but as a depth so whole it had no need to act, no impulse to command, no urge to create. This vision, preserved in Gnostic writings that later fell outside what the early church chose to keep and were left beneath centuries of dust and fear, begins not with creation, but with what existed before creation ever made sense, before the first word, before light learned how to separate itself from darkness. It speaks of a presence so full that nothing was missing, a stillness so complete it held every possibility without ever moving, not a king on a throne or a father in the sky, but an infinite quiet where all being rested unspoken. And this is where the familiar story begins to soften and bend. In these ancient tellings, the God who shaped Adam from earth, who flooded the world, who demanded loyalty and sacrifice, was not that deepest source. He was something closer, something narrower, a maker rather than the origin, born from a distant echo of a higher fullness. The texts call him the demiurge, the shaper of matter, the architect of limits, a being who fashioned flesh and time without realizing there was a silence beyond him, a depth he could not see. Let that image linger for a moment. A creator convinced of his own supremacy, speaking laws into a world without knowing he stood inside something greater. Beyond the heavens he built, beyond angels and hierarchies and sacred order, the source remained untouched, unseen, unnamed. This is not an invitation to reject what you were given, but to look at it from farther back, as the mystics did, sensing that truth moves in layers. Some layers guide the many, others wait quietly for those who feel the pull to look deeper. In the Apocryphon of John, this source is described not as something you approach or appease, but as immeasurable light, pure and undefiled, a presence so absolute that even existence seems to soften around it. It does not intervene, does not judge, does not demand devotion. It simply is. And if this stirs something uneasy or familiar inside you, that may be because this story is not only about ancient cosmologies or lost texts, but about the subtle sense you've carried that reality is larger, quieter, and far more intimate than the surface you were taught to accept. If the silence you just felt hinted that reality might unfold rather than be commanded, then this next movement asks you to look even closer, because in the oldest stories, existence does not begin with an order shouted into the void, but with a quiet overflow. From the perfect wholeness of the source, everything arises not through intention or desire, but the way light spills naturally from a flame that never weakens. The ancient texts describe this as emanation, a gentle unfolding rather than a deliberate act, where the first expression was known as barbello, a luminous reflection, often sensed as a feminine presence, not separate from the source but mirroring its depth and completeness. From this reflection came other intelligences, subtle and radiant, each one carrying the same light while stepping slightly closer to form, to definition, to individuality. And with every step outward, something almost imperceptible changed. The farther existence moved from its origin, the heavier it became, denser, more structured, more forgetful of where it came from. This is not told as a fall in the moral sense, but as a gradual narrowing, like a song becoming quieter as it travels farther from its source. At the outer edge of this unfolding, wisdom itself, Sophia, reached for creation alone, without balance, without reflection, and from that imbalance emerged the maker of this world, the shaper of matter and time, the one who fashioned bodies and boundaries while believing the horizon he could see was all that existed. Pause here for a moment. Notice what stirs when you imagine a creator unaware of anything beyond his own limits. The ancient writers lingered on this image, not to accuse, but to explain the strange tension of living in a world that feels both beautifully ordered and painfully incomplete. They wondered why such stories were buried, why voices carrying these ideas were silenced, their words burned, their names erased. If these were only harmless myths, why the urgency to destroy them? Perhaps because the implications quietly shift the center of gravity inward. In this telling, liberation does not arrive through obedience or fear, but through remembering. The Gnostics spoke of knowing not as collecting beliefs, but as a deep recognition, a kind of inner awakening that feels less like learning something new and more like recalling something long forgotten. They suggested that every human life carries a trace of the original light, a small but unextinguishable spark woven into flesh, moving through a world that constantly pulls attention outward, away from that quiet center. The structures of this age, the systems of power and rule, were seen not as monsters, but as expressions of that same forgetfulness, reinforcing a reality of separation because they cannot perceive anything beyond it. And yet, there is something in you that was never part of that design, a memory older than the world you were born into, untouched by its limits. This is why certain texts portray Christ not as a sacrifice demanded by a distant ruler, but as a revealer, a guide pointing back toward an inner origin, reminding listeners that the kingdom is not housed in buildings or doctrines, but hidden within awareness itself. When words attributed to him speak of bringing forth what is already inside, they read less like commandments and more like mirrors, asking you to notice what has always been present beneath the surface of your life. In this view, the source does not wait for praise, cannot be offended, and does not judge, because it lacks nothing. It simply flows, silently, through all that exists. And you are not separate from that flow, even if it feels obscured, even if life has taught you to forget. What you experience as confusion, longing, or restlessness may be the quiet pressure of that original light pressing against the walls of habit and belief, inviting you to look again, not outward for rescue, but inward for recognition. If what you just sensed feels like a quiet pressure to look inward rather than outward, that may explain why this perspective was never meant to be easy to find. The old texts suggest this knowledge was hidden because once the search turns inward, familiar structures quietly lose their grip. When a person realizes that access to the source does not pass through institutions, titles, or rituals, an entire structure based on control and mediation begins to weaken. In this view, no priest stands between you and what is sacred, no authority can sell redemption, and no outward performance can replace the moment when awareness turns back on itself. The instant that recognition begins to form, control quietly slips away, not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. This was the truth buried beneath layers of doctrine and decree, because a system can guide belief, but it cannot govern knowing. Across different cultures and centuries, those who looked deeply enough seemed to brush against the same silent presence, even though their languages and symbols differed. In Jewish mysticism, it appears as the endless, unknowable depth that exists before structure or form, long before creation organizes itself into names and patterns. In Hermetic thought, it emerges as the living mind in which all things arise, as thoughts rather than objects. In Taoist writings, it flows as the unnamed way that moves through everything without being confined by anything. The words change, the metaphors shift, but the gesture remains the same, pointing beyond what can be grasped. What these traditions quietly agree on is not a doctrine, but a limitation. The mind cannot capture this source, logic cannot frame it, and language only circles its edges. It is approached instead through stillness, through surrendering the tight grip of identity, through a soft unraveling of the ego that mistakes itself for the center. Seen this way, awakening is not a journey to somewhere else, but a subtle recognition of what has always been present beneath layers of forgetting. And this is where the story touches your life directly. If the ruling power of this world is not the highest expression of reality, then your struggles are not signs of failure, but symptoms of living in a place shaped by limitation. Pain, confusion, and longing gain context. They are not punishments, but signals that this world is not the final horizon. The Gnostic imagination described the soul's passage beyond death as a movement through layers of control and illusion, guarded by forces that test not obedience, but remembrance. The names and gates are symbolic, pointing to inner thresholds where identity loosens and recognition deepens. To pass through is not to escape life, but to awaken within it, remembering a belonging that predates fear. In this telling, liberation is not granted by belief, but by insight, not earned through submission, but revealed through awareness. You are not portrayed as broken or unworthy, but as luminous, having forgotten how to see in a world designed to keep attention outward. Those who shaped early doctrines understood the power of this idea, which is why they chose certain texts and silenced others, favoring belief over knowing, because belief can be guided, while knowing quietly sets a person free. And if something in you recognizes this tension, that may be the same quiet memory pressing forward now, inviting you to pause, to look again, and to consider that this moment might matter more than it first appears. What you've just moved through doesn't ask you to choose sides or abandon anything you once held dear. It simply invites you to notice what has already been stirring beneath the surface. If parts of this felt familiar, unsettling, or quietly reassuring all at once, that response carries meaning of its own. Nothing here arrived too early or too late. The questions that surfaced, the pauses where something seemed to soften inside you, the moments of resistance or recognition, all of it belongs to where you are now. There is no sense of urgency to become something else, no demand to prove worth or understanding. The current you're standing in has its own rhythm, and you haven't missed it. The ancient voices you've encountered today never spoke of awakening as a leap forward, but as a gentle turning back toward what was never truly lost. The source they pointed to does not wait for perfection or effort, only for space, for quiet enough moments where remembering can happen naturally. If the world has ever made you feel small, fragmented, or distant from meaning, that feeling was never a verdict on who you are, only a reflection of the limits of the surface story. Beneath that surface, the same stillness described in these traditions continues to hold, patient and unchanged, regardless of how long it takes to notice it. What was hidden was not hidden because it was dangerous to you, but because it was disruptive to systems built on distraction and distance. And even so, it has a way of resurfacing gently when someone is ready to listen without force. You are not behind. You are not outside the circle. You are not overlooked. The sense that brought you here is the same one that has guided countless others through moments of quiet reorientation, when the search relaxes and something deeper begins to settle. Nothing needs to be resolved tonight. Nothing needs to be decided. Let what you've heard rest where it landed, like a seed placed into the right season. If there is more for you here, it will unfold in its own time, through the same thread that led you to this moment. And when you feel that quiet pull again, the path continues just ahead, waiting to be explored a little further. As you sit with what you've just heard, what part of it is still echoing quietly inside you, not as an answer, but as a question of its own? There's no right or wrong response here, only reflections shaped by where you are right now. If you feel like sharing a thought, a doubt, or even a sense you can't yet name, you're welcome to leave it below as part of an ongoing conversation. And if this kind of exploration feels meaningful to you, staying connected through a like or a subscription can be a gentle way to continue walking this path together, one reflection at a time.